It brings me great delight today to be able to welcome Ryan Bennett, who is the pastor of the First United Methodist Church here in Lebanon. Ryan, I'm going to begin my interview of you by asking you to tell us a little bit about your story and what in your story brought you to be a United Methodist pastor.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mike. I told you ahead before that we were recording that I was glad to answer any questions on the table except who my problematic church members are, because several of them are on the administration and faculty of the university. I don't want to name any names on that, but I am glad to be here with you. The way I answered my call, it was interesting. My degree is in kinesiology, which is the study of the movement of the body, a physical therapy related degree, and my plan was to go and get my master's in physical therapy. And one of the things that was needed at the time, because it was so competitive, was to come back and build up hours in the clinic. So I came back to my hometown of Cookeville, graduated from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, came back to my hometown and was working in a physical therapy clinic there, building up my hours, and got back involved in my local church and enjoyed working with the youth and being a part of some of the missions and other things in the church. But one of the things I've come to see during that time of being in a physical therapy clinic was that what I loved the best was that people would come into the clinic who were hurting. They were struggling physically. They had different ailments. They'd had surgeries, knee replacements, shoulder surgeries, any number of things. And it was my job to make them feel better. It was my job to help them to leave in a better place than when they came to see us. And I came to also realize, and this is just to put it bluntly, is that it's amazing what people will tell you when you have them naked on a table and start rubbing their butt. And the truth of the matter is that I would be doing deep tissue massage on people with sciatic nerve pain. You're digging down right there at the, we're kind of on their leg and on their butt and all those kind of things. And they're physically vulnerable to you in that moment. And when they become physically vulnerable because they're exposed, then all of a sudden they become emotionally vulnerable as well. And in those times, in those rooms, as I was trying to help them to feel better physically, they would begin to share with me and talk with me about other things, about just how lonely they were, or about addictions that they were struggling with, or about an affair that they had had on their spouse, or any number of other things that they felt very vulnerable in that moment and were able to share. And I was not a counselor, and I didn't attempt to be, but I was able to just listen in that ministry of presence, that ministry of being there in that moment and listening to them and having someone that they could confide in, that they felt safe with, who they knew was their job to help them feel better. I came to realize that was valuable. And so I feel like that my time in physical therapy helped prepare me for ministry. And it's still the thing I enjoy the most about being in ministry is when people come in who are hurting. And it's my job to help them to feel better, help them to get in a better place. I had the opportunity, somebody asked me if I would consider being the youth director for a church in Crossville, and I sort of ran from it a little bit, and my plan was, to go get my master's in physical therapy, and that's what I was doing. And eventually I sort of gave in to the fact that I might try it out for a year or two, see how I liked it, get it out of my system before I went on to school, and tried that in 1998, January 6, 1998. Never looked back. So 23 years later, still in the local church full time. And I'll tell you, the immediate benefit for me through that was that's where I met my wife. The chair of the interview committee that interviewed me is now my father-in-law. He likes to tell people, what do you think I was interviewing him for? One of my youth volunteers is now my mother-in-law. One of my youth is now my sister-in-law. One of my golfing buddies was my wife's grandfather. And I sort of became friends with them all while she was at this school a little bit to the west, Cumberland University, playing golf there. And so she came home for spring break, and I was having lunch at her dinner table, and her mom knew that I was smitten pretty much off the bat, and that began our journey together. So it was through that not only did I have a lifelong call, but I found a wife out of that too. So.
Good story. Our president, one of your unnamed church members, troublemakers, is actually here today. He's often said that his pastors are good for nothing. Now that he knows you do deep tissue massage, he may let you work on his shoulder, which he's had a real hard time with. When I look back at the local church and its ministry, especially during these very difficult times when it seems like I can't tell whether it's all hell's breaking loose or at times all heaven's breaking loose. It kind of depends on the day. It seems to me that with COVID and with the political divide in our country and with the racial tensions resurfacing, that being a pastor today is pretty close to impossible. How do you negotiate? How do you navigate the fact that in any given church, you've got church members who very intensely have feelings and beliefs, opinions, loyalties that are in opposition to one another? As a pastor, how do you do church in a time like we have now?
Yeah, it's had its challenges for sure. I'd like to talk about when we were looking at the kind of the reopening last May of 2020 after the shutdown at the beginning of the COVID cycle. I was getting lots of feedback from parishioners about our decisions to reopen the building of the church and those kind of things, and was getting plenty of phone calls and emails and texts. And within a 30-second period, I had 2 emails come in. The first one said, I can't believe we're not already opened as a church because this is being way overblown. And the second one was, I can't believe we're even considering opening at this point because we're in the middle of this pandemic. And so there was definitely those tensions there. And over the last year, not only have we had tensions around the pandemic and the responses and how to handle it and protocols surrounding that, especially masks, but then we've had the racial overtones that really were set off with other things, but in a large scale sense with the George Floyd death. And then we've also had the political issues of a political cycle that just continues to get nastier and nastier. And one of the things about the United Methodist Church that I believe is its blessing and curse at the same time is that we have a big umbrella, and we have people that across the theological and political spectrums, from the far right to the far left and all in between. And so we manage it, and I think it's okay to live in tension. I don't think that we have to be all in agreement on everything. And I think that we've sort of lost that. We've forgotten some of those things. At First Methodist, what we've tried to do through this pandemic is to hold in equal tension the safety of our people, which has been important through this pandemic, and the mission of the church, that we don't sacrifice the mission, we don't pause the mission of the church. We just have to be creative in how we carry that out. And we've tried to make sure that neither one outweighs the other, that we're not sacrificing safety for the mission and we're not sacrificing the mission for safety, that we're able to carry them both out in equal tension and hold them in high regards. And so we've tried to do that. And one of the things I do in dealing with these differences that we have in our church is to help people to understand that if we have that first priority in order, if we have Jesus as our first priority, then we can disagree just about on anything else and still live in community with each other, still live hand in hand and work in ministry. That it's pretty boring when we all agree on everything, that there's room for disagreements, there's room for differences of opinion. That goes back to our spiritual father, John Wesley, who really had a few things that were kind of non-negotiables for him, but you could count those on one hand with probably a finger or two left over. And he says, on those things I'm an oak and I won't be moved. But he said, on everything else, if your heart is as my heart, then take my hand. And I believe that kind of defines how we live in ministry. We don't have to agree on any number of things to be able to impact the world together and be the church together.
Ryan, your denomination's my denomination, and so I'm aware that our United Methodist Church looks like it may become an untied Methodist Church due to our reaching a point where there are some non-negotiables on both sides that look like will result in a split, the only split in my lifetime. I always used to brag, I guess that was a sin, that Methodist, instead of splitting like other Christian denominations, seemed to be a denomination that if we split, we came back together eventually. Do you have any opinions or any insight on what's going on with the denomination today?
Sure, I think the reference of no splits in your lifetime refers back to the last time we split was 1844, around the issue of slavery. And truthfully, even then, if you look back, it was a presenting issue of a much deeper thing of basically split along political lines, along geographic lines, and those kind of things. And I see a similar thing today with the presenting issue being around the process around LGBTQ folk. And so there's definitely two different opinions on it. I think there's, that each of them are very heartfelt, followers of Jesus coming up with those kind of things. And so it's sort of kind of at an impasse. And I think that for me, I think a majority of United Methodists are tired of fighting about it. And so what I envision happening is probably very similar to what happened in 1844, is that I believe that there will be two or even more multiple pathways of Methodism that will begin to emerge post-2022, which is the next time our global gathering will happen. And they'll kind of resolve this issue in their minds by having people yoke with one side or the other. But eventually I think that they'll work these things out, and we'll see a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades down the road that probably coming back together like the post-slavery church in the 1920s. Did. And so I think that, but I think that one of the things that we have to be careful about, it goes back to the previous question you asked, is that why do we have to resolve all of these things that we're not in agreement with? Why do we have to have where we can only worship with people and be in community with people who think exactly like us? That's a dangerous place to be. And I think that we've seen that a lot of times there's churches that are built on that model of their church growth model is to get mad at each other and split and form different churches and grow like that. And I think ultimately it's weakened them over the course of the long haul. And we're moving into a new season of ministry, and I think that we need each other, not only within the United Methodist Church, but within all of the church, within the big C Catholic Church, the universal church, that we're going to need each other in this sort of the world has changed over the last year, 14 months through the pandemic. And I think that we need to drop not only our differences around politics and issues like this, like LGBTQ issues, but also around denominationalism, about where the Methodists and the Baptists and the Church of Christ and the Catholics differ. Because if we're going to be effective in doing what we're supposed to be doing as the church, we're going to need to work together and lean on each other.
Well, you anticipated a follow-up question that I had for you, and that was where you saw denominationalism going, because there's been a movement over the last couple of decades of even those churches that affiliate with a denomination not being public about it. So they've taken the denominational name out of their name so that they aren't attached with whatever biases or stereotypes people might have of that particular denomination. You've mentioned racial issues that have resurfaced. I go back to being in college during the Civil Rights Movement, 67, 68. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated just down the street from where I was in school. You have a son, an adopted son, who is African American. And I was wondering if you would share how your perspective on race and racism is affected by your son, and you're seeing the world through his eyes.
Yeah, obviously I've become more sensitive. I hope that I've always sought to try to do what's right around the issue of race, but obviously having a son, now I have a vested interest. Part of my job as his dad is to protect him. And so I'm sensitive to those things. And so when I see things that come out like what happened to Trayvon Martin, who's just, when he was shot and killed, is just about 3 years older than my son is now. And it scares me to think that my son could be out walking by himself one evening, as I did when I was a teenager, as teenagers do, and he's close to being a teenager, and that someone could single him out and seek to cause harm to him simply because of the color of his skin. And that's a very scary thing as a dad to want to do, and it's almost overwhelming, and with the reality that there's no way that I can protect him all the time. And so to try to help him to understand those things and understand that there are people who have these biases, who hate not based on the type of person that someone is, but based simply on things like the color of their skin, or even, this week, the color of their skin and the shape of their eyes, or different things. We see this not only around the African American community, but we've seen this here recently with the Asian community. And this week we saw a shooting in Atlanta that seems to be, from the early releases, motivated by persons of Asian descent who are here, Asian Americans. They're relating back to premises around the beginnings of the COVID pandemic that started in Asia, in China, and sort of a bias, a racial bias on that. I served and lived for several years in Crossville, where there was a Japanese prison camp in Cumberland County, Tennessee, in World War II, where they rounded up Asian Americans living in the community and put them in concentration camps. And so this area around race is greater than African American, and it's just kind of an uncomfort that I see of people around people who are different than them. And so I think that we have to look and work and try to see, the commonality we have with the other in our midst, and whoever that other is, and to try to seek to look at what we have in common, what we can do together, how we can be in community together, instead of looking at our differences. Because if we continue to look at what our differences are, whether it's around politics or race or denominationalism, all these things we've been talking about, then we're going to eventually find ourselves in a very small group. And truthfully, if we have to find somebody to be in a group that agrees with everything that I agree with, then I'm probably going to be in a room by myself. And I know my wife wouldn't be in the same room with me for sure. But I just think that we need to move past this. And I think that comes by extending mercy to people, grace to folk, to kind of give a benefit of the doubt when someone offers an opinion or a thought different than us, instead of trying to hammer them, instead of trying to just really beat them over the head with it, but just to recognize their experiences is different, the way they grew up is different, and so they may see things through a different lens than I do. I had someone, when in the aftermath of the George Floyd death, I saw that our community, a big part of the Lebanon community, was hurting. The African American community was really hurting, and they just wanted someone to hear them. And so we tried to do that, to let them know, hey, we're listening, we're hearing you. We started implementing Monday morning marches out of the church, that we'd march up to the square and just say, hey, it's not just on you to raise awareness on what's going on and the inequalities and the racism that's still present in our world. We want to take some of that load off of you, and we're here to partner with you and be a part of that. And was challenged on that at times, and called a Black Lives Matter church even. And my response to that is, we're not a Black Lives Matter church, we're the church. And the church should believe that Black lives do matter. And so that's what we tried to do, was to do the right thing, to be a church that cares about its community. And that means all of the community, not just the people that look like us or agree with us, but to be that church for everyone.
Ryan, you mentioned your wife Heather, and I know her and know a little bit about what she's involved in. Would you tell us what exactly she does and how that fits in to yours and her faith commitment?
Sure. Yeah, Heather has always connected with God through nature. And sometimes people have misunderstood that and thought that it was some kind of new age sort of religion, and it's not. She's connected to the creator of the universe by being in the midst of God's creation. And that's always been something, and it's only been late in life that she's recognized that what she's been told all her life, that's not where you can connect with God. You connect with God in the church. You connect with God through the Bible. You connect with God in these ways. That this is not about being a Christian. It's not environmentalism. Are tree huggers. Christians, are Christians, and that those two really don't meet, and she never bought that. And finally, she read a book 15 years ago that sort of gave a language, gave a voice to what she felt in her heart, and it just was like her heart saying, with an understanding that this is who she is, and that these pieces of her life, her faith and her care, her love of creation, are not incompatible with each other, are not separate from each other, that they are of one thing. And so she's been on a journey. She went and got her master's in sustainability through Lipscomb University. and we started a nonprofit really to help the church, to help Christians to understand what she always knew, and finally got a language to talk about it with, to understand our biblical call as followers of Jesus to care for God's creation, that this is an absolute core part of who we are, that the first command that God gave us, for instance, was to tend the garden, to be a good steward over the creation. When he put Adam and Eve in the garden and said, take care of it, to have dominion over it. Dominion is a misused word. It's to make sure that it flourishes, to make sure that it thrives, to make sure that it's cared for wisely. It's a recognition, in essence, that it's not ours, that creation was here before us and it'll be here after us, and that we have it for such a short period of time, and it's our job to tend it. If you loaned your car out to a buddy, to a friend, and they brought it back to you with Coke spilled in the dashboard and scratches and dents all over it and empty on gas, you're going to be frustrated because they didn't care for your car. They didn't care for your investment. And the same thing, I think God's kind of given us the keys to creation and say, I want you to take care of it for this season that I'm letting you borrow it, season I'm letting you use it. And that's our responsibility to do. And she takes that seriously, and she helps Christians to understand that not only are we called to do that as a sign of loving God, but if we, God says or Jesus tells us that the whole law is summed up in loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we say we love our neighbor, if we're called to love our neighbor, then we should want to protect our neighbor's air supply. And we know that there's so many people that have asthma and breathing issues and allergies and stuff that are related to poor air qualities. So we should want to help to make their life better. And we show a love for neighbor by trying to protect the air quality and making sure it's good. The same with water. We can't go 3 days without drinking water. So we need to protect our neighbors' water supplies and make sure that all of our neighbors have access to clean water. And food. So much of our food is tainted and spoiled and rotted and not worth eating, that we need to make sure that our neighbors have the food they need to eat and that it's quality food and not full of pesticides and herbicides and those kind of things. And so we want to protect our neighbors. By loving our neighbor, we make sure we protect their water supply, their food supply, their air supply. And that's not just our neighbors of today. That's our future generations of neighbors who will come after us. And so as followers of Jesus, as Christians, it's part of who we are, is to be good stewards of this creation of the environment that God has given us.
Ryan, I have really high standards for the people that I admire, especially in the role that both of us have tried and continue to try to fulfill. I want you to know how much I admire you, and I'm glad that you decided to become a pastor and not a baseball player. I think at one time you had aspirations to play ball, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that was my first love. In fact, yesterday I got back from a spring training baseball trip with my brother and dad in Florida, and it's always something I love, to play ball. I've got season tickets to Cumberland baseball and love getting out there in an afternoon. My office is close enough where when I have the window open, I can hear the announcer calling the game, and then that kind of calls to me and it makes me wrap up my business and get over there as soon as I can in the afternoons to watch Coach Hunt and his team play. But yeah, I love playing it. I love watching it. I love being a part of it. It's just something that is a release for me. Baseball is America's pastime, and I love the pace of it. I love what it allows. While you're watching it, you can have conversations with people and build relationships in between pitches and those kind of things. It's a slower game. I love the strategy involved in it and the kind of the mind games around it. I tell people oftentimes that baseball was my first love, that Jesus came after that. Now, it may not be that order now, but it definitely holds a special place for me. So,
as I noted earlier, our president is with us today, and I'm going to ask him, do you have a question you'd like to ask your pastor?
Thank you, Mike, for letting me. I wasn't planning to be a part of this other than just observing, but I want to thank Mike Ripsky again for having all of these series of great spiritual leaders in our community. And I have been so blessed to have first Mike Ripsky and now Ryan Bennett as my personal pastors and friends. And I actually got to have coffee with Ryan Bennett this morning, and I get to have coffee tomorrow morning, I think, with Mike Ripsky. Do I? Is that right? Okay, good. So, no, I don't have any questions for Ryan. He's answered all my. He deals with me all the time, and but he really has been a great spiritual leader for our church and for me personally, as have you, Mike. And so I'm grateful for that. And thank you for having Ryan here today with us.
Ryan, I'm going to conclude with a question that I've asked the other spiritual leaders that have been with us. What word would you want to speak to college students today? You're empathetic. You have a good idea of what's going on at this life stage that they are in. What wisdom would you pass on to them?
I think the word would be selfless. What I see a lot of the problems that you are and will inherit are due to selfishness. People who are power hungry, money hungry, will do what benefits them even if it costs others. And I think that it's causing great harm in our world. And I think that the way, and you're going to inherit that, and already are inheriting that, I think the way to combat it is truthfully a way that Jesus not only taught through his life, but modeled through his life. And that's selflessness. It's really giving our life away. And in giving our life away, we find true life, is what Jesus says. And what I mean by that is I think we find fulfillment. And so what I see in these folks who are doing what's best for me and the heck with you, that selfish attitude, is they're trying to fill a void, and there's never enough of that to fill that void in their life. And so they continue, and they just, it's never ending. But when I'm able on my better days to put my selfishness aside and act in a selfless way, I find fulfillment in ways that I could have never imagined. When I give my life away, when I serve others, when I put my focus on trying to help someone else and off trying to do what feels right for me or what's best for me, then what I find is a better life than I could have ever imagined. And so if I could say one word to you, it would be selfless. And I think that as you would seek to live that out in your life, as I've sought to try to live that out in my life imperfectly, with plenty of flaws, I find a better life, a life that I think many people are missing, but a life that gives me joy and passion and fulfillment like I could never experience when I'm acting in a selfish way.
Ryan, amen to that, and thank you very much for being with us today.